You've heard of Kirk Franklin and Mary Mary. But what about the gospel legends who came before them? From church-shaking voices to Grammy-winning groups. Here are 15 gospel bands you probably forgot ever existed. Let's kick things off with a legendary family group from Detroit that turned gospel into smooth R&B magic. 1. The Winans. The Winans were a group of 4 brothers from Detroit: Marvin, Carvin, Michael, and Ronald Winans. They weren't just any random family. Their parents were deeply religious, and they grew up singing in church. Now, in the 70s and early 80s, gospel music was very traditional. Think organs, choirs, and long songs. But the Winans added something no one expected: R&B and soul vibes. Their music felt modern. It was groovy, catchy, and sometimes sounded like something you'd hear on a pop station, but with powerful spiritual lyrics. That's why so many people connected with them. They were discovered by gospel legend Andraé Crouch, and from there, things blew up. Their first album, Introducing the Winans, dropped in 1981. It didn't just stay in church communities, it crossed over. Their songs started getting played on radio stations that never played gospel before. These weren't just gospel songs. They were emotional, real, and honest, and they sounded so smooth, like even people who weren't religious listened to them just because the music was that good. One of their biggest hits, It's Time, even got them a Grammy. They made gospel feel relevant to younger generations, and they opened doors for artists like Kirk Franklin, Fred Hammond, and even modern acts like Jonathan McReynolds. At their peak, the Winans were basically the Michael Jackson of gospel. They won Grammy Awards, Dove Awards, and Stellar Awards. They performed at the White House, toured internationally, and even had their own TV appearances. They didn't just sing, they made gospel cool. They were also one of the first gospel acts to get mainstream record deals, thanks to Quincy Jones. Their style influenced so many gospel and R&B artists after them. In fact, their family legacy is still strong. B.B. and C.C. Winans, Marvin Winans Jr., and Deborah Joy Winans are all from this same family tree. Like many great bands, the Winans eventually slowed down. They released fewer albums in the 2000s, and each brother started doing their own thing, pastoring churches, solo projects, and producing music behind the scenes. Sadly, Ronald Winans passed away in 2005, and after that, the group didn't really perform as the Winans again. Over time, newer gospel artists took the spotlight. Social media changed the music game, and many Gen Z listeners today don't know the Winans, even though their music is timeless. 2. Commissioned. Commissioned was formed in Detroit in the early 1980s. This was around the same time other gospel groups were also trying to modernize their sound. But Commissioned wasn't just another band, they were different. The original members included Fred Hammond, Mitchell Jones, Keith Staton, Michael Brooks, and a few others. Later, Marvin Sapp, yes, the guy behind Never Would Have Made It, also joined. Fred Hammond was the main guy. He played bass and sang. He later went solo and became a huge star. But his roots all start here. Now here's what made Commissioned stand out. Back then, most gospel music still had that choir vibe, lots of organs, tambourines, and long dramatic runs. Nothing wrong with that, but Commissioned added something new. Their songs had smooth harmonies, modern instruments, clean R&B vibes, and relatable lyrics. They sounded more like Boyz II Men than your grandma's gospel records, but still kept the message about faith, hope, and Jesus. Their debut album, I'm Going On, 1985, instantly made noise. But it was albums like Go Tell Somebody, Ordinary Just Won't Do, and Number 7 that really hit deep. These weren't just hits, they were life-changing for many people. Whether someone was going through heartbreak, anxiety, or just questioning their faith. Commissioned had a song for it. Commissioned never really went viral. This was way before YouTube or Spotify. But they built a loyal fan base. They were huge in the gospel community. Think sold-out concerts, gospel award nominations, and even some crossover attention from R&B artists. They also influenced future legends. Guys like Kirk Franklin, Yolanda Adams, Jonathan McReynolds, and even Usher have mentioned commissioned as an influence. So if they were that good, what happened? Like many great bands, life took over. Members left to do solo projects. Fred Hammond started his own group, Radical for Christ, and became super famous. Marvin Sapp went solo too. Over time, commissioned just kind of faded into the background. Also, newer gospel artists like Mary Mary and Kirk Franklin brought even more hip energy into the scene. That made commissioned seem a little old school, even though they were the ones who made that space possible. 3. The Clark Sisters. Okay, picture this. You're watching a gospel concert, and someone introduces Karen Clark Sheard. The crowd goes wild. She's iconic, right? But what if I told you that before Karen was a solo star, she was part of one of the most powerful gospel girl groups in history? Yes. The Clark Sisters weren't just Karen's family. They were a full-blown group, with hits, drama, church battles, and even a movie made about their life. It all began in Detroit with a woman named Dr. Mattie Moss Clark. She wasn't just a regular church mom. She was a musical genius. She taught music at churches, trained choirs, and knew exactly how to blend voices like no one else. Now here's the cool part. She trained her own daughters, Jackie, Denise, Elbernita, aka Twinkie, Dorinda, and Karen, to form a gospel group. From day one, their sound was different. Most gospel groups were powerful, sure, but the Clark Sisters had something special. Perfect harmonies, fast runs, jazz-like style, and that soulful church fire. Their group officially launched in the 1970s, and people were not ready for what came next. And it was basically gospel music with a disco beat. Yup, it was like church met the dance floor. And guess what? It worked. The song became a crossover hit. It landed on R&B, gospel, and dance charts. That had never happened before. Churches were playing it. Radio stations were playing it. Even people who didn't go to church were listening to it. The Clark Sisters didn't just win awards. They influenced every female gospel artist that came after them. But here's the sad twist. Over time, as the sisters grew older, they started doing solo work. Karen Clark Sheard went solo and had a massive career. Dorinda Clark Cole became a TV host and gospel star. Twinkie became a legendary songwriter and pianist. People started seeing them as individuals, not remembering they once ruled the stage together. Also, there was family drama. Denise left the group. Twinkie left the group and came back. Their strict upbringing and church pressure led to a lot of tension, and it slowed down their momentum. In 2020, Lifetime released The Clark Sisters, First Ladies of Gospel. It told their full story, how their mom trained them, how the church doubted them, how they made it big, and how fame almost tore them apart. The movie reminded a lot of people, oh wait, they were a group first. But even today, if you ask young gospel fans, they might know Karen or Dorinda, but not the Clark Sisters as a unit. 4. Trinity 5-7. Let's go back to the late 1990s when girl groups were dominating music. TLC, Destiny's Child, and Spice Girls were everywhere. But in the middle of all that, there was a gospel girl group that came through with their own style, message, and flair. Their name? Trinity 5-7. Yeah, I know. The name sounds like a Bible verse, and that's because it is. It's based on 1 John 5:7, which talks about the Holy Trinity. But don't let that fool you. These girls weren't your average choir singers. They were fashion-forward, confident, had R&B vibes, and honestly, they looked like they belonged on the MTV Awards red carpet. That's why people started calling them the Destiny's Child of Gospel. Trinity 5-7 was originally a trio made up of Chanel Haynes, Angel Taylor, and Terry Brown Britton. Later, Terry left, and Adrian Anderson joined, becoming part of the most popular version of the group. Their debut album dropped in 1998, and it was a game changer. Gospel music had seen women shine before, like the Clark sisters and Yolanda Adams. But Trin ET 5.7 brought something totally new. Their sound was a perfect mix of gospel lyrics with smooth R&B production, something you could vibe to and still feel spiritually uplifted. Their first hit, God's Grace, blew up on gospel charts, and their album went gold, which is not easy in the gospel world. People couldn't get enough of their style, their harmonies, and the fact that they made gospel music feel young and exciting. But even with all their success, they started fading from the spotlight. Why? Well, like most music groups, they had label issues, internal disagreements, and shifts in the music industry. Around the 2010s, gospel music started going more digital and independent. Plus, the group members began focusing on solo projects and other ventures. Adrian eventually left the group. Chanel and Angel tried to keep it going as a duo, but by then the buzz had slowed down. The group wasn't releasing albums like before, and younger audiences started turning to newer gospel artists like Kara Sheard or Jonathan McReynolds. 5. The Rance Allen Group. If you've never heard of them, don't feel bad. A lot of people haven't, especially today. But here's the thing, they were way ahead of their time. In fact, they were mixing gospel, soul, funk, and R&B long before it was cool. They made gospel feel alive and electric, not just holy and traditional. And that's exactly why they were special. The group was led by Rance Allen, a preacher with one of the craziest, most powerful voices you'll ever hear. His voice could go from super smooth to insanely high-pitched in seconds, like a mix of Stevie Wonder and James Brown. But for Jesus. Along with his brothers Steve and Tom, they formed the Rance Allen Group in the 1970s. Most gospel at that time followed a very standard format: choirs, church organs, and very serious energy. But the Rance Allen Group brought something completely different. They had key guitars, funky bass lines, crazy vocal runs, and beats that made you want to move, not just pray. Their breakout moment came when they signed with Stax Records, which was known for soul and R&B acts like Otis Redding and Isaac Hayes. That in itself was a big deal. A gospel group getting signed by a secular soul label, it just didn't happen. But Rance Allen wasn't your typical gospel artist. Their music was full of energy, with lyrics that were spiritual, but production that sounded like something straight out of a soul concert. Songs like Something About the Name, Jesus, Miracle Worker, and I Belong to You made it clear that you could love God and still jam out. They also opened doors for future gospel stars who didn't want to be boxed in. Without the Rance Allen Group, artists like Kirk Franklin, Ty Tribbett, and Dietrich Haddon probably wouldn't have had the freedom to mix gospel with hip-hop, pop, and rock like they do today. But sadly, as time went on, they started to fade into the background. They never really stopped making music, but gospel itself changed. The industry started focusing more on polished worship bands and softer sounds, and the raw, funky energy of the Rance Allen Group felt like it belonged to a different era. Also, newer fans often skipped over them because they weren't trending. That's the unfortunate truth. In 2020, Rance Allen passed away. And that's when many people finally looked back and realized how much they had contributed. But by then, it was kind of too late to give them the flowers they truly deserved while Rance was alive. Now let's go even further back, way back to the roots of modern gospel. The next group didn't just sing songs. They helped launch Sam Cooke's career. 6. The Williams Brothers. Now, before you think this is just another family band singing hymns in a church basement, let me stop you right there. These guys had a crazy deep discography with over 40 albums, Grammy nominations, and songs that ruled the gospel charts for years. But for some reason, they're not talked about much anymore, especially by younger gospel fans. And honestly, that needs to change. The Williams Brothers started way back in the 1960s. The group was formed by Leon Pop Williams, a preacher, who had a vision of his sons singing for the Lord. His sons, Doug, Melvin, and Franklin, became the heart of the group. Over the years, other brothers and relatives joined, but Doug and Melvin are the ones who really carried the torch for decades. Their sound? Smooth, soulful, and deeply Southern. It wasn't flashy or overproduced. It felt like real-life gospel, music you could feel in your bones. They combined quartet harmonies, traditional gospel roots, and a little bit of that bluesy Mississippi flavor. It wasn't made for trends. It was made to touch hearts. These weren't just gospel hits. They were life anthems. Like, even if you weren't religious, those lyrics hit deep. They talked about struggles, survival, family, faith, and staying humble no matter how high you climb. And guess what? They didn't stop in the 80s or 90s like most gospel groups. These guys kept pushing through the 2000s and even the 2010s, still dropping albums, still touring, still inspiring new gospel artists. They were gospel lifers, in it for the long haul. But here's the sad part. Despite all that work and all that success, the Williams brothers don't get enough love today. Why? Well, part of it is that their style wasn't mainstream flashy. They didn't go viral. They didn't dance on stage or remix their songs with rappers. They stayed true to their roots, which is amazing. But in today's fast-moving, social media-driven world, that often gets overlooked. Also, because they've been around so long, a lot of people just kind of assume they've retired or that they're part of old gospel. But if you check out their newer music, it's still fresh. It still speaks truth, and it still sounds better than half the stuff that's out today. And let's not forget, their influence didn't stop at music. Doug and Melvin both went on to mentor young gospel artists and started record labels to help others rise. They gave back to the gospel community, helping the next generation of voices be heard. 7. The Soul Stirrers. That name might not ring a bell for Gen Z or even millennials, but without them, gospel and even soul and R&B music wouldn't be what it is today. So, who were the Soul Stirrers? Well, they started way back in the 1920s, which already makes them one of the oldest gospel groups ever. They weren't just a group singing in churches, they were innovators. Before the Soul Stirrers, gospel music was mostly group singing with simple harmonies. But these guys added lead vocals, emotional solos, and a deeper connection to the lyrics. Basically, they took gospel from sounding like a choir to sounding like a story being told through song. And then came the game changer, Sam Cooke. Yes, the Sam Cooke, the man behind A Change Is Gonna Come and Cupid. But before he became a soul music legend, he was just a young gospel singer with a smooth voice and big dreams. In 1951, at just 19 years old, Sam joined the Soul Stirrers as their lead singer, replacing R.H. Harris, who was already a gospel star at the time. This move literally shifted gospel music overnight. With Sam Cooke's voice and the group's tight harmonies, they created a sound that felt fresh, emotional, and modern. Songs like Jesus Gave Me Water, Peace in the Valley, and Touch the Hem of His Garment became instant classics. And these weren't just church songs. People from all walks of life connected with them, even those who didn't go to church. That's how powerful their sound was. Now, when Sam Cooke left in 1957 to go solo, some people thought the group might fall off. But they didn't. They brought in new lead singers like Johnny Taylor, who also became a solo star later, and kept the spirit of the group alive. The Soul Stirrers continued to record and perform for decades, keeping that old-school gospel energy going even as the music world around them changed. But here's where it gets kind of sad. New generations barely know who they are. Even though they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and have been cited as a major influence by artists like Aretha Franklin, Otis Redding, and even Kanye West, most people today don't realize how important they were. 8. The Dixie Hummingbirds. The Dixie Hummingbirds started way back in 1928 in South Carolina. Imagine how wild that is. They were performing before World War II even started. Over the years, members came and went, but the group never stopped performing. That alone is amazing. But what made them even more legendary was how they blended gospel music with energy, stage presence, and vocal power that had never been seen before. Most gospel groups back in the day would just stand and sing. But the Dixie Hummingbirds moved, danced, shouted, and owned the stage. People hadn't seen gospel performed like that. It wasn't just spiritual, it was electric. And that energy influenced tons of other artists. Even James Brown and Jackie Wilson, who were major R&B stars, took notes from their style. But their vocals were on another level too. They had tight harmonies, dramatic leads, and this deep emotional delivery that made you feel like you were in church, even if you were listening on a radio. One of their most iconic songs is "Loves Me Like a Rock," which they did with Paul Simon. Yes, that Paul Simon, the one from Simon and Garfunkel. When a white pop legend calls up a black gospel group from the 30s to sing on his song, you know they must be something special. And guess what? They won a Grammy for that performance. But even with all of this, awards, history, influence, the Dixie Hummingbirds kind of disappeared from public memory. Why? Well, music changed. Gospel evolved into contemporary sounds. Flashier artists came along. Social media made younger fans forget about older groups. And because the Hummingbirds were from such an early era, they didn't always get the digital love that newer artists get. But here's the thing. They were pioneers. They helped shape gospel, R&B, and even soul. Without them, a lot of today's music wouldn't sound the way it does. They were trendsetters before trending was a thing. 9. The Canton Spirituals. The Canton Spirituals were formed in the 1940s in Canton, Mississippi. Yep, that's where the name comes from. They were one of those classic quartet-style gospel groups, tight harmonies, simple instruments, and powerful lead vocals. That's the traditional gospel vibe most Southern churches loved. But what made the Canton Spirituals different was how they blended that old-school gospel sound with modern production. They didn't try to be flashy or go viral. They just updated the style to make it feel fresh for a new generation. Think smooth background harmonies, soulful leads, and relatable lyrics about real-life faith and struggles. The face of the group is Harvey Watkins Jr., who took over after his father, Harvey Watkins Sr., passed away. Harvey Jr.'s voice is unique. It's got that raw emotion that pulls you in, especially when he sings about pain, healing, or just trusting God during hard times. He doesn't need auto-tune or fancy effects, just a mic and a message. During the 90s and early 2000s, the Canton Spirituals were a huge deal in the gospel world. They won stellar awards, got nominated for Grammys, and performed at major gospel festivals. People loved them because they stayed true to gospel roots but didn't sound outdated. But today, they don't get talked about much, especially by younger fans. That's mainly because music trends changed. Gospel started blending more with hip-hop, pop, and contemporary worship. Artists like Kirk Franklin and Tasha Cobbs took over the mainstream space. And since the Canton Spirituals didn't switch up their style too much, they slowly faded from the spotlight. But fading from the spotlight doesn't mean they stopped being great. Their music is still being played in churches. Their message still speaks to people who are going through real struggles. And Harvey Watkins Jr. still tours and keeps the legacy going. 10. The Caravans. You might not hear their name in modern playlists, but back in their time, they were superstars in the gospel world. And guess what? They helped launch the careers of some of the biggest gospel legends, like Shirley Caesar, Inez Andrews, and Albertina Walker. The Caravans were formed in Chicago in the early 1950s. At that time, gospel music was mostly male-led groups or choirs. A powerful all-women gospel group, that was rare, but the Caravans came in and completely changed the game. Their music wasn't just about sounding good, it was about delivering a message that hit you right in the soul. Their songs were filled with emotion. They sang about struggle, hope, pain, and faith. And each member had a voice so strong you'd feel like the whole building was shaking. These weren't just pretty church songs, they were powerful performances that made people shout, cry, and believe again. One of the group's early leaders was Albertina Walker, also known as the Queen of Gospel. She had a deep, rich voice and strong stage presence. But what made her legendary wasn't just her singing, it was the way she mentored other women in gospel music. Thanks to her, the Caravans became a training ground for future gospel stars. That's where Shirley Caesar comes in. She joined the group as a teenager and brought this raw, fiery energy that made people stop and pay attention. If you know her solo hits like No Charge or Hold My Mule, just know she got her start with the Caravans. Same with Inez Andrews, who had this unique high-pitched voice that could pierce through any crowd and leave people in tears. But like most old-school groups, the Caravans eventually slowed down. Members left for solo careers, and the group faded from the mainstream spotlight. And as new gospel styles came in, like contemporary hip-wop gospel or worship music, the Caravans became part of gospel history books instead of playlists. But here's the thing, their impact never faded. Every female gospel artist today owes something to the Caravans. They opened doors, broke barriers, and proved that women could lead gospel with strength and soul. 11. The Blind Boys of Alabama. The Blind Boys of Alabama started all the way back in 1939, yes, before World War II, at the Alabama Institute for the Blind. These guys were literally teenagers when they formed the group, and most of them were blind or visually impaired. But their voices? Next level. They weren't just a novelty, they were serious artists who could stir your soul with just a few notes. In the beginning, they sang traditional gospel, hymns, spirituals, and church music. But what made them special was their ability to evolve with time. While many gospel groups stuck to one sound, the Blind Boys kept experimenting. They blended gospel with soul, blues, funk, rock, and even indie music. That's how they stayed fresh even decades later. Their voices are full of emotion, sometimes joyful, sometimes heartbreaking. They don't just perform, they testify. Every note feels like a prayer wrapped in music. Now, they didn't hit mainstream fame right away. For years, they toured in churches and small venues. But in the 1980s and 1990s, people started rediscovering them. And by the early 2000s, they were winning Grammy after Grammy. In total, they've won 5 Grammy Awards and even got a Lifetime Achievement Award. That's a big deal. And it's not just awards. They've performed with artists across every genre, from Prince to Bon Iver, from Willie Nelson to Bono from U2. They've even been featured in movie soundtracks and Broadway plays. That's how wide their impact is. One of their most famous albums is Spirit of the Century, 2001. It was different. It had guitars, harmonicas, and gritty blues vibes, but the lyrics stayed true to their message: hope, faith, and fighting through the darkness. 12 Sounds of Blackness. All right, if you've ever heard the song Optimistic, you know that super uplifting track that sounds like a warm hug for your soul. You've already heard Sounds of Blackness. But here's the thing. Most people think they're just another gospel choir. They're way more than that. Sounds of Blackness isn't just a choir. It's a full music group that mixes gospel, jazz, soul, R&B, and even hip-hop. That blend made them one of the most unique and powerful music collectives to ever hit the stage. But sadly, not many people from our generation know their name. They started in Minnesota back in the 1970s, but they really blew up in the 1990s, especially with the release of their hit Optimistic. That song alone became a black cultural anthem. It wasn't just about faith. It was about hope, power, and pushing through life's struggles. If you've ever had a rough day and needed a boost, Optimistic is the kind of song that makes you believe things will get better. Oyuroa. What makes Sounds of Blackness different is that they don't limit themselves to one genre. They'll sing a gospel song, then switch it up with jazzy horns, R&B rhythms, or spoken word poetry. They talk about real-life issues, racism, poverty, mental health, self-love, but always tie it back to strength, community, and spiritual power. And the group is big, not just one or two singers. We're talking about a whole group of vocalists, musicians, poets, and artists, all led by the brilliant Gary Hines, who's been their music director since forever. Under his leadership, Sounds of Blackness created music that's not only good to hear, but also good for the soul. In their peak, they won multiple Grammy Awards, performed on huge stages, and even had features on TV shows and soundtracks. Their music wasn't about being trendy. It was about sending a message, one of resilience, beauty, and unapologetic blackness. But in recent years, they've kind of faded from the spotlight. Not because they lost talent, but because music trends moved fast and people stopped paying attention to artists who weren't going viral on social media. That's a shame, because their music is still incredibly powerful and even more relevant today. If you learned something new, hit like, subscribe, and check out our next video on Forgotten Music Legends.